Welcome to the EmpowHERment Show, a podcast designed to empower women like you to take control of your lives, make informed decisions, and redefine success on your own terms, beyond the noise of influencer culture. Welcome to the EmpowHERment Show, everyone. We're super excited to have our guest today, Troy Tazbaz. I'll introduce him in a bit and talk about how we met. Today, we're going to be talking about a variety of topics, including pursuing a career in public service, the U.S. healthcare system, and cancer, specifically colorectal cancer, and how it is rising in younger generations and why that is very concerning. To give a bit of some background on how Troy and I met each other, we both live in San Francisco. In fact, he's like literally, I think I could like throw a football. Well, probably not actually, but like theoretically I could to where you live.
Someone probably could. Maybe someone could.
Somebody would get hurt in the process, but he lives very close and he's become a very dear friend. And very grateful to have you here today and be able to hear your story and share it with our listeners. But we met on the dawn of 2020. We were on a New Year's trip at the end of 2019 in Kona, Hawaii.
Oh, this is that trip.
This is that trip.
I don't know this trip.
So it was hysterical because it was the most random group of people. Like you had fresh out of college or like in college students, and then you had like mid-20s. I was 25 at the time. And then you had, some older folks.
It was a multi-generation.
Wow, Maddie. Why are you so loud right now? Wow.
I'm sorry. I should have. Yeah. Anyway, it was multi-generational. Let's just use Dama's word. And there were like 30 of us spanning Gen Z, Gen X, millennials, everything in between.
The old ones. Yep.
Yeah. The old ones. Anyway, you're never going to let me live that down. But Troy and I were sitting at the bar in the house like the first night. Everybody was wasted. And I think you and I were heading in that direction, but we were still, somewhat together. Just having fun, kind of observing the debauchery. And like we'd never met before. And I'm just sitting next to this guy and I am like, so what's your story? As I normally do to strangers.
Yep. That's
hence the show. And we started talking, and after a couple glasses of wine or maybe a couple bottles, Troy, you told me all about what you had just been through, and you left a big mark on me, obviously, not just because of, that story, which I would love you to tell next, but just because of everything you did after, which I want you to tell our listeners about today too. So I think with that, Troy, why don't you start from the beginning in terms of when we met, what you had just experienced?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just say thank you for having me. I was excited to be on this podcast. I know that it's a growing audience, and I'm sure it's going to be an amazing between the two of you. Probably fantastic guests are coming on too, and so I'm just honored to be part of it as well. But when I met you and Maddie, I mean, obviously I was I don't want to say I was forced to come on this trip, but one of our very mutual friends, Brianna, who I've known for, at this point, I think somewhere around 15 years. As a matter of fact, I officiated her wedding as well. She was like, we need to get you out of San Francisco. And why that was is that 2 months earlier to that trip, I had lost my wife to cancer. And so I was, kind of hesitant to go on a trip where I did not really know anyone. But, Brianna, the way she kind of operates is that she really wants to kind of connect people and make people happy. And so she was kind of concerned about me and she kind of, I don't want to say forced me, but really pressured me in coming on this trip against my kind of better judgment at that point. Now, granted, I'm so glad I did go on that trip because I ended up meeting Madeline, who I've become really good friends with, and other people that I'd also still keep in touch with. And so, sometimes these experiences, you don't know where it's going to take you and lead you towards. And so in that sense, it was probably the right thing to do. But you also have to remember, this was, I lost my wife, Bryn, at the end of October, and shortly after that, we had a pandemic after this trip. And so now here I was dealing with grief in a now locked in world where we're completely isolated. And, a lot of people kind of consider maybe isolation is probably not the best place to be when you're dealing with the type of grief that you're dealing with. And so I was pretty much in that state for a while, but I was also working for a company where they really knew very well, and they understood that keeping me very occupied and intellectually stimulated was a good thing. And so I kind of ended up throwing myself into just the job. And they were throwing many, many problems at me, including giving me new organizations to fix, organizations to launch. So I had a variety of responsibilities. But throughout that, there was something that was really kind of stuck in my mind where I was like, I need to do something in my life that I would have only probably done because of this experience that I went through. Like I wanted for some reason, and what I learned throughout that process is that it's never going to make sense. You really will never be able to rationalize it. But in my mind at that point, if I did something big, I could at least justify, well, I only did something meaningful because of this experience. And so I ended up launching the healthcare business unit for the company that I was working for. And that kind of led me into really the healthcare system and trying to understand what was going on with it. But of course, as a caregiver, taking care of my wife, I had to really live in a hospital, and she was very critically ill. I mean, matter of fact, from the time that she was diagnosed, so she was diagnosed with a very late stage cancer.
And by the way,
of course,
within the first year of your marriage.
It was in the first year of our marriage, yeah. So she was diagnosed 6 months after our wedding, actually. And so I had to really immerse myself in kind of the process. And throughout the caregiving duties, one of the things that I became very aware of and also frustrated was how difficult it was for, navigating the system, having to make decisions in where, you're dealing with a whole litany of issues, both on the clinical care side of things and decision making, but you're also having to make decisions when you're mentally, I would say, not necessarily in the right frame of mind. And so, one of I would say a pivotal moment in my life was, there were two things. One was, I was sitting next to her in the ICU, and there were something like 20 different IV bags hanging from the IV tree. And I was like kind of looking at all this. I'm like, does she need to be pumped with all this medication, right? And then this, young resident came in and, decided to hang another one. And I just asked the question, like, what is that for? And he goes, well, she had these kind of like numbers that are probably from a side effect of another thing. And I said, well, is it within the range of acceptable, side effects with the combination of drugs that she has, the drug-drug interaction and physiological response to that? And he went, I don't know. And I said, don't you think you should know that before you had another one? And so finally, our oncologist came in, who's been doing this for 4 years, and said, don't hang that. And that was like the first kind of moment I had where I was like, why is technology actually not part of this? Like, a human is never going to be able to have, unless they have like this incredible, experience and knowledge. But even if you have that much knowledge, there's still more data that is coming at you at every single point in time. Mm-hmm. The second one was when she was very critical the first time, and we weren't sure she was going to be coming out of the state that she was coming in. We had a variety of doctors coming in and telling me different things about her state, her condition. And there was a lot of conflict. And so here I am as a kind of a mentally struggling caregiver, having to absorb all that information, synthesize it, and then make a reasonable decision on what I want to do. And finally, I just said, you know what? At 2:00, there's a room right next to it. It's empty. I need the 9 of you to come into that room. And we're going to talk this throughout. We're going to talk this thing out. Now, here's the reality. I was also a fairly senior person of a very large corporation dealing with very complex situations. So I was somewhat to a degree trained to kind of deal with complex situations. But I felt that it was incredibly unfair for the rest of the public who maybe doesn't have that type of skill set or experience that I have had, that I was able to develop in my career, to go through and navigate these issues. And I felt it was just in a very unfair system, right? And this is where kind of the health equity issues really start. I mean, it starts in everywhere else. So I ended up launching the healthcare business unit, and we ended up acquiring a company, and I was asked to integrate the company. And I just realized, so this is back in now summer of 2022. So about 2.5 years after I lost my wife. And the world is opening up again. And so, integrating the company, especially the size of the company that we acquired, it was a $27 billion acquisition. It's a 5-year, 6-year commitment. And I had, I think I was looking for a document on one of my drives, and I came across this Excel sheet that I had created 10 years earlier. It was to bike across the country. And it was unreasonable in many ways, but nonetheless, it kind of stuck with me. And I said, you know what? That's something that I really want to do. And I ended up quitting the job after they asked me to take a sabbatical. And I said, I didn't want to be tethered. I didn't want to feel obligated to come back because I didn't know what state I was going to be when I came back. But I ended up biking across the country. And that led to a series of decisions that I made throughout, and which is why I'm probably on this podcast, is that I ended up going and working for the FDA, working on health policy, particularly around artificial intelligence. And so that's kind of led to a series of, I call it butterfly effects of changes in my life that I ended up doing. So I moved to DC for a couple of years, did that for a couple of years. And then I recently moved back to San Francisco. And that's where we are.
Butterfly effects. I mean, thank you for sharing your story with us, but I love that. Actually, I call it the shampoo effect, like when it just starts bubbling up and then it gets beyond your control. But I love that.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that you turned your grief and your passion into something that, was meaningful.
At that point, I asked this. So here's what I've learned about kind of, grief comes with a very high energy emotion, anger. And anger has a lot of energy, and it has to be directed to something. And I realized that, if I was directing it to my community, I'm just being destructive. If I'm directing it to myself, I'm being self-destructive. Or I could be constructive. And those are your three options. And I'm not saying that it was always easy to say I'm going to be constructive. Sometimes you really wanted to be destructive or self-destructive. But nonetheless, I try to keep my eye on the ball to say, you know what, I have a specific experience and skill set. Let me see what I can do with it. And against the anger that I still had about, the experience.
Yeah. Something that was just so astounding to me too, Troy, when we met, because after this trip to Hawaii and after, hearing about all this, and, by the way, I was 25 and I'm still, obviously young now, but back then, I was a whole different person. And I remember we would go grab wine together in the marina, or this was pre everything shutting down, in those months right between, right? And then, have dinner, and we would have these very just lengthy, intellectual, all kinds of tangents kind of conversations with each other about life and love and grief and everything in between. And the way you were navigating all that, and you were almost talking about yourself in the third person, looking at your life objectively and everything that was happening and that you wanted to do. And I'll never forget those conversations, and just how much I admired your strength in being able to take that position and look at the situation and go, as shitty as this is, I'm going to do something about it. And your grief was still very raw at that point, but you were still taking this mindset around creating change and, and taking action regardless. And obviously you channeled that into what you've done over the past few years. And it really, really amazed me. And so I just wanted to express that to you. Which is a great segue into, when you went to the FDA, can you talk about what you were asked to really do? I mean, you mentioned AI and healthcare policy and all the inefficiencies and opportunities, but what were some of the challenges that you were really tasked with helping resolve?
And how did that happen? How did that opportunity
Going back a bit even. Yeah.
How about that?
I know, like, know thyself is my rule number one. And I feel like I would have spent at least the first 6 months being very self-destructive. And so, like, you clearly channeled yourself into something that was absolutely not that.
Well, I think my 20s had probably a lot to do with it, where I was very self-destructive at that point, and maybe I was slightly wiser this time around in my 40s. Yeah, I'm one of those people that really I value reflection in yourself, right? I mean, you have to kind of take stock of where you are at all times to be able to kind of understand. And the other thing that I really learned from Bryn, my wife, was about emotional honesty and being okay with kind of when you're not feeling well, right? Try not to fix everything. Where, typically, especially as a male, like we think we can fix everything, whether it's in our control or not in our control. And, I had to learn really the hard lesson, especially when you're dealing with depression and you've never dealt with depression before. As a person, I've never experienced depression until, grief. And all of a sudden I'm dealing with things that I maybe I'm not equipped to kind of know how to resolve. And so I seeked a lot of help also to say, like, this is really beyond my capabilities. And that's something, again, if you don't have a self-awareness, you'll never be able to address that.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't trying to mask the issues that I was going through, right? I was being very open and honest with myself around where I do need help and where I can actually maybe think differently. But I also was like, hey, if I'm not feeling well, give yourself the permission to not feel well.
Mm-hmm.
About the how the whole government thing came about, it's kind of interesting because so I came back from a bike ride, and it took me 2 months to go across the country. I started in Maryland in the Atlantic Ocean and finished in Pacific Ocean, under the Golden Gate Bridge.
Wait, and by the way,
typical, very easy, quick bike ride. Obviously,
it was a very casual.
Was this just you? Was
casually.
this other people?
It was just Troy. And I was following him on Instagram. You were like keeping a lot of your friends updated. And, he'd be in Kentucky and then he'd be in, some other state in the middle of the country and like the next day. And I just like,
what? How?
We need like a podcast just on the bike ride.
That's a full-on podcast. No, I had bags on that bike and I biked from one location to another just by myself. And the surprising thing was like, a lot of it was like, well, did you have a lot of time to think? No, you're biking in sometimes state highways. You have no time.
Yeah.
There's a lot of end of the day reflections that you
I didn't even know you could bike across the country. Like,
sure,
what about like Nevada?
Did you find that was helpful, Troy, to have the moments of like, because I know for me, I will throw myself into a project. If I don't want to think about something, I would be like, what's the most emotionally avoidant thing that I can do right now? But there's that dynamic of like, I can't focus on any of this right now because I'm biking on a highway, but then you're alone at night, right? You really have to like, and here it is, me with myself, the person I'll spend my life with, actually, like, where am I? I mean, that's a lot. I don't know that I would do that. I mean, I would.
If it was maybe very soon after, that would be one thing, but it was 2.5 years after. So almost close to 3 years. And so, grief is all about also the space that you get from the reason of what caused. And so the more space goes by, the more that you have reflection time. And so because it's no longer a reaction. It's more of a, I would say, proactive kind of addressing the situations that you're going through or the emotions that you're going through. And so I think that if I had done this sooner, then it probably would have had I would have had a different response or emotional relationship with the experience, but I did this almost 3 years later.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, I arrived exactly at where we got married the day before our wedding anniversary. So exactly 4 years then after. And so, and that was not planned, by the way. That just kind of happened as I pulled in the schedule and I ended up gaining a couple of days because I was just kind of biking along, and sometimes the experience was just cycling. It wasn't really going anywhere. It was just being on the road. But when I came back, I wanted to also, and I was just so fortunate to be able to say, I don't right now, I can take time off. I can, take space. I could get bored, which, I had been working since I was 17 years old. And so it was kind of, here I am almost 30 years later, like the first time that I'm going, oh, I don't really have anything to do. And I always say this to people who want to take a sabbatical. I said, make sure you are doing it for all the right reasons, and make sure that you also, if you really want to take time off, like get bored, because that's when you'll really truly be inspired. If you're distracting yourself, you'll never really get inspired in any ways. But I was about, people were calling me and they were like, hey, what do you think about doing? Are you going to go back to your company? I said, no, not really. I'm not sure yet. I mean, I really wanted to take a year off or so and just volunteer and do things. And in the back of my mind, I also wanted to be a professor. So I said, maybe I can move towards that goal. And then I went out to a restaurant with just dinner with a couple of friends who were CEOs in the health tech business. And they said, hey, the FDA is actually looking for someone like you, and they've been calling, and we gave them your number and your name, and, would you mind talking to them? And I was like, government. I was like, never imagined working for the government. And, it's funny.
You're like, oh, like we're the government, we're here to help.
Well, we all have perceptions, right? We have our ideas about what government is. And their criteria was just very interesting. They wanted someone with a tech background from Silicon Valley who did not have any healthcare background, who was young and energetic, mission driven, and maybe financially secure because they don't pay it. And so, that number, it quickly starts narrowing down, right?
Not a lot of
they were like, there's one guy and his name is Trump.
Yeah. There's like one guy who was like kind of doing that. And so I said, why not? Right. I mean, again, just take a call. Take the meeting. And so I ended up taking the meeting. I had an initial fantastic conversation. And then I had about probably 20 other conversations. Now, to your question around, Maddie, what did they ask me? They didn't ask me to do anything. They asked me to, what do you think needs to be done? This was the brilliance on their part. And here's why I think it was the brilliance on their part. Having someone like me come in and do exactly what they tell you to do is probably not why they would hire someone.
Right.
They would hire someone like me because they're going, we have to figure out what we need to do.
Yeah.
And so I would say out of that 20 conversations, most likely 12 of them were driven by me, because I needed to understand what the hell I was getting myself into. And then what I did was I talked to some industry folks. I talked to some VCs, and then big kind of pharma that I had contacts with. And then I talked to some health tech startups, and because you wanted to really understand what your ecosystem is, like who are your constituents.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up writing a 2-page document about my understanding of what was going on. And I said, based on all the conversations that I've been having, here's what I believe the objectives should be that we need to tackle. And I sent that to FDA, the commissioner, and so on and so forth. And they're like, this is exactly what we're looking for. Now you have to come in and execute them. So I was, I wasn't told what to do. I was told to figure out what needs to be done. And so I ended up doing that. And when I came in, we aggressively started pursuing some of these strategies. And part of it was, doing a kind of an inventory of what is being done right now, making sure if it aligns or it doesn't align with our new objectives, because I was also inheriting an organization. And we just end up kind of tackling these things. And a lot of them at a very high level, it was more around, on the AI front of things, it's like, well, what's different of this product that we have to think about regulation different? So we really invested heavily into trying to understand it. A lot of people, when they think about AI, they think about ChatGPT, but nonetheless, healthcare has been using AI for a very long time. It was just predictive AI, which is a little bit more controllable. It doesn't evolve and like generative AI does. And all of a sudden, we had to think very differently about this new product that was coming into the market that has different considerations, different operating characteristics, and then, of course, different guardrails that you have to implement in order to make sure that they're safe and effective, which is, the FDA's guiding principles. And I believe that's really healthcare's guiding principles: safe and effective. Make sure it's safe and make sure it's effective for the intended population.
Well,
so those were the folks there
to even figure that out, right? I mean, when California started passing privacy laws recently, we had to spend 2 years rolling everything back to make sure that there were exemptions just so that data could communicate things like, is my pacemaker working? I mean, as soon as you start trying to rein in technology, you don't know that history of how involved the technology is in the healthcare. It gets, you can harm people trying to help them.
Since you two are actually, Madeline, you've done this as well in government affairs and lobbying. I mean, one of the things that I really fought really against is states trying to do this individually. And,
Story of our life, literally.
yeah. And by the way, I mean, I did this in Congress as well, right? Where, there were some discussions around maybe states should be regulating AI. And the example that I gave when I was meeting with congressional members around this, I said, look, I mean, I'm not going to really talk as a regulator. I'm going to talk as a business person who's had to do investments. And the example that I gave was, EU is at 27 different markets. As much as that they say they're a single market and data privacy laws, they have data sovereignty also. And so as an infrastructure investor at that point in my life, I was having to invest in 27 different markets, or the markets that I deemed to be, worthy of investment. And so I used that example when I was talking to congressional members around, well, now let's apply that to 50 different states. There's a couple things that will happen. One, you will effectively drive regulatory capture because only large businesses can afford to deal with 50 different states and 50 different regulations. But second of all, many states will not be targeted for this investment or the innovation that will come because it's too small.
Right.
There are states that are still that they have 100 million people. And so businesses don't think in terms of like, well, that's a state that I'm going to have to go through the exact same investment strategy
things special
as, let's say, California, Texas, Florida, New York, and so on and so forth.
I'm not dealing with any of these states because I'm not going to do 50 states. I'm not going to negotiate
you prioritize
for individual state. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, you prioritize heavily. That's how business works.
Right. What did you, on the note of how business works, what was something that surprised you about working in the public sector? Maybe some like misconceived notions that you had going into government.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I had all the ideas and opinions that most people have, but I think, I can't speak of it for the entire government, apparatus, if you will. But certainly the folks that I worked in healthcare, they're very dedicated individuals. I mean, they're deeply committed to the cause of why they're there. And, I always used to say, like, don't use the government. Don't go into government if you're idealistic. Go in there because you believe that it's the best vehicle to accomplish things that you want to accomplish. But there's also people who are very deeply idealistic and wanting to make sure that our people, our population, our citizens are safe. They get the best products. We improve outcomes, which, every statistics unfortunately is pointing the other direction right now, but that is beyond, in my opinion, regulators' control. And I would say, and also just incredible intelligence. I mean, the wealth of knowledge and education. I mean, I have a bachelor's degree and I felt so undereducated. I mean, every single one of my employees are either a PhD or JD or an MD. I was like, they had deep expertise and knowledge, and what they wanted to dedicate that deep expertise, knowledge, and years of education was to improve public health. And that to me, it was a very stressful job, but I never complained. I was like, because we're there. We're there to do something bigger than us as individuals. And that's how I felt. And, I still feel that way about public service. And, one thing that I think people who have the luxury to kind of complain about it maybe never went into it. And so now that I've been into it, I like, my hat's off to anyone. It doesn't matter what administration. Generally speaking, people go in there because they believe it's the right thing to do, and they believe they're going to do the right thing.
Right. And I think it's so important that when people are, when I started working in public service, I already had about 10 years under my belt out of public service. And I was young still. I was almost 30. It was in my late 20s. And I was like an old person to get into it. And I think it's so valuable. And I think, frankly, it was very smart to sort of say we have to deal with all of these changes and emerging technologies and things. And we need people that have been in the field that understand it and can come in and give that level of insight. So you sort of need both, right? I mean, like you need the bank of brilliant PhDs that are impassioned about doing this work, but you need people to be able to come in and say, actually, this is how business works. Right.
It's always a combination. I think it's a balance between the application of something, right? And so I used to say, because my job was to develop policies and regulation, and I said, an unimplementable policy is just a piece of it. And so that's where I think the balance comes in, where you always have to kind of really balance between the academic aspect of what happens in government, which you really need that often, because you are actually, academia to me is like, it's never meant to be completed. And that's what you need to drive progress, right? You need that constant rehypothesizing about something or new hypothesis.
Yeah.
But a business person's mind is like, okay, some hypothesis is good, but we still have to have an application strategy, which means there has to be an end date and a completion. And that's where I think, we made a very, very good couple, like between me and the government and anyone who's coming into the government from the more business side.
Super important. I think a lot of times we pass legislation and we're like, we did it. We did it, guys. And then it never comes to fruition. It does not actually fix the issue. And there's not any sort of iterative process.
It's hard to have, it's hard for regulation to be agile. And part of it is that because it takes, the process of passing a law is very difficult, right? I mean, you have to go through so many iterations. There's a lot of clearance steps you're dealing with. One, you're dealing with agencies, then you're dealing with sister agencies who may have equities in it, and then you're dealing with the White House, who says this is what I want to prioritize and don't want to prioritize, and you need our support. Then you have the industry saying that, we want to comment on the regulation. And so, the process of going through, it was one of the more fascinating, I would say, experiences of my career, going through that process of knowing exactly how regulation gets kind of built, right, and developed. And for me, I used to say I was a salesperson. I was selling the idea to the various constituents that I had, whether they were elected officials or sister agencies that have some responsibility in my areas. Then I had the industry, and then in the industry, I had to break it out into kind of big med tech versus small startups who also are looking for some say into this. And like, you're balancing all of that. And then you have to start thinking also about, can you drive international harmonization in a lot of this stuff? Because they're also looking to the United States for some thought leadership. And so, for me, what was so fascinating was, and I don't know of all the experiences, but we actually we would write down a sentence in what we would want in a regulation, and then we would have to implement that sentence. Both how would the industry implement it, but how would we as a regulatory agency? That was a fascinating. And what I did from an agile perspective is that, more often than not, regulatory agencies or the government works in a very waterfall methodology. Mm-hmm. What I did was I brought in the stakeholders during the initial conception of it to make them part of the solution and not the problem. One of the things that I did not want to do is write something and then it get redlined by all the lawyers before it even gets to the next. And so I incorporated them and I said, this is my goal. These are my goals. This is the objective of this particular legislation. Now let's work through it. And they were fantastic in just kind of giving me, this might pass, this might get, challenged a little bit. You have to start thinking about lawsuits from the industry. I mean, all of those really come into play, as you all very much know, that you have to really think through. And so I wanted to make sure that whatever we did is going to pass the muster against all of the different potential constituents that are going to have some say.
So I have a specific question for you. you said something to me that I would love you to talk about. You said we don't have a healthcare system, we have a sick care system. What do you mean by that? And how do you contextualize that against like the backdrop of all these budget negotiations going on?
Well, a healthcare system is exactly what it sounds like. It's caring for your health when you're healthy. It's changing the way that you're thinking about health and maybe to even preventative measures. The sick care system is exactly like you get sick, you go to the hospital and you try to get better. We have, our current form of healthcare is all about you don't engage with your health until you're actually sick, that you need some either a doctor or, and I recently read the study. This is a perfect kind of example. And since, the theme that really brought us together today is cancer, but Kaiser. Now, I'll say this, now that I'm no longer in the government, I could be very open and honest about this. Single payer systems tend to actually perform better because they're motivated to improve, right? Because they're covering and they're providing. If you don't have that, and we've seen this throughout, right? Is healthcare better in a, let's say, a Kaiser system, in a VA system versus somewhere else? The other issue when you don't have a single payer system is also insurance companies don't know if their current customer is going to be their customer, 5 years down the line. So preventative measures are really not necessarily focused on. Now, Kaiser did this study. This is a fascinating study. Now, my wife had, she passed away from colon cancer, which is, it's actually rising considerably among young, particularly females. And no one really knows. There's a lot of hypotheses of why that's happening, but no one can actually pinpoint. And the average diagnostic age has been coming down pretty significantly. Kaiser did a study over the last, I think it was like 20 years, if I recall the study itself. But they did, they started sending out fecal tests to their patients. And out of that very lengthy study, they discovered that there was a 33% reduction in colon cancer related deaths because they were catching these things very early on. If anything, if there are polyps, if they're this, like now how colon cancer is really caught is through colonoscopy. That's the usual. But if you think about it, a fecal test is a very non-invasive and a inexpensive way of having some efficacy. And it actually had pretty good efficacy. And they actually tested against population, age, race, and they found consistency across all of it. So it was actually not the test itself, but it was the administration of the test. Because you don't really have to schedule something. It's low cost. And a couple of years ago, I spoke at the Aspen Ideas Festival. And that year the healthcare was the theme. And I gave some statistics and I said, look, I mean, the problem, they asked me to actually, for 2 minutes, they asked me to give a big idea to kick off the conference itself. And they gave me 2 days, actually not even 2 days, maybe a day before the conference was kicking off to come up with a big idea. And I said, well, the reason I'm probably even in this place is because of cancer. And so I started looking at the cancer statistics. And it was something like we spend $210 billion a year. Well, first of all, we have about 17 million people living in cancer in the United States and about 1.7 million or so new diagnostics every year. And that's projected to go up to about 2.3 million new patients by 2030. And in addition, we spent $210 billion a year in treating cancer, and we spent another $50 billion a year in research and development. There has been about 90 or so treatments approved by FDA over the last 20 years, and the average life expectancy has gone up by 2.8 months, which means that you could say it's not really effective. And part of the problem is that cancer is a very, very smart disease. It mutates multiple times, and we're trying to solve this thing with cancer, static treatments. But the reason I wanted to give that statement is because what I said in that big idea is, why are we not investing more into preventative care? Like, can we reduce the cost of care? And you can apply that for a lot of different things. Like if you were able to reduce the cost of screening.
Mhm.
Being able to bring screening tests or methodologies to rural areas without actually having a brick and mortar hospital system. And the Kaiser study effectively is that, right? It's taking an alternative way of looking at potential of cancer diagnosis through fecal tests. Now, it's not 100% accurate like colonoscopy, but it's pretty accurate that it results in a fairly large decrease in cancer-related deaths, and that for the people who are actually on it. And
Yeah.
so, and I think that's what I mean by healthcare system is like we have to engage with our health in different manners throughout. Maybe you have like an age strategy, or a decade strategy.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I mean by when I say we don't have a healthcare system in the United States.
I was for the first time today asked to do a colorectal screening.
Yeah.
And the nurse
Wow.
practitioner was surprised when because I said, no, I've never been asked. And she was like, yeah, we're trying to get people starting at 40 now, especially women. So it's
That's new.
Interesting because I have celiac disease, and like one of the only ways that you diagnose it, or at least one of the previously 20 years ago, was that, and it was like impossible to get one. It's like I have a medical history, I have all of the symptoms, and they wanted to do everything but that. I mean, you really like had to pay out of pocket, like go to Stanford to get it done.
right. Right.
Or you just had to sort of make guesses, like, well, I can't get this medical test, but my symptoms look like this, obviously pre, WebMD and ChatGPT and everything else. So I guess I will just adapt my diet. I mean, really kind of a nightmare for something that, in other countries, in non-US countries, especially in Europe, there are places that do mandatory testing for that at birth because like 1 out of 10 white people in certain European countries have celiac disease.
Oh,
So
wow.
it stands to reason that we would, I don't know, have a cure with all of the white Europeans that moved to the US, but it was virtually impossible. So it's good that is something people are thinking of more and talking about more, but getting, healthcare providers and insurers to cover it.
Yeah.
It's such a battle. I've been dealing with a bunch of like gut issues for probably the past decade, honestly. And I'm now working with an integrative doctor. So she does like part Western, part Eastern medicine, because none of the traditional doctors could help me. Like they did testing to screen me against celiac disease, but like I didn't have the marker. And so they were kind of making me feel like I was making this up in my head when I knew for a fact when I had gluten, like it's not good. And so I had all this blood work done, and then I did the whole stool test too. They did the GI map, and everything came back. And she was like, "Yeah, so there's a lot going on with you, and like we're now figuring out a plan and trying to get me to feel like a human again." But it's gotten me thinking about this whole trend where colorectal cancer is rising. It's now the leading cause, or like leading cancer case for men. It's the second for women now. And I think the like age of diagnosis since the year I was born has doubled. Like it used to be like, 1 in 10 people, 1 in 20 people, and now it's like 1 in 10, which is crazy. But on social media, we like to talk about toxic trends on this show. And so I'm always like looking on social media and seeing what people are talking about related to our topics. And something that I've noticed, and I'm totally getting targeted because it knows that all my search history is around like gut health and dealing with IBD and IBS and all that. And I'm getting all these ads and, like influencers telling me to take like whatever root vegetable capsule every day, 10
whatever
times a day.
Mushroom, whatever.
Yeah. Or to like drink raw milk or like do whatever.
Do that.
Definitely do not drink raw milk.
Don't. Oh, I feel like we would endorse a lot of things on this podcast, but if we could just agree that we don't endorse drinking raw milk, that maybe the boost.
I think we're good there. But yeah, like there's a lot of theories that are out there, Troy, on social media around this rise with this particular cancer. And it's all probably, most of it is probably a crock of shit, to be quite pun intended, or not intended. But I'm curious for your thoughts.
Interesting choice of words.
I'm curious for your thoughts because you are somebody, and I've always really admired this about you. You base your opinions in facts and data and research. And so I'm curious, based upon what you have read, what you think is contributing potentially to this very concerning rise.
Oh, I mean, God, this is why I don't want to necessarily answer this because I don't want to come across as I'm the expert in this area. I'm not a scientist. There are studies around. Now they're saying vitamin D deficiency is causing some of it, which I'm not sure how. It could be the chemicals in our food value chain, supply chain. Things have changed, right? A lot more chemicals are being used. There is, I mean, a ton of studies that are coming around. Is it the chemicals that we put in our body that are seeping through for some odd reason? Makeup is now being kind of evaluated. It's kind of there's so many different hypotheses at this point that it's hard to kind of tell. Now, I think the ones that I would always kind of stay away from is that someone who has really no scientific background, no medical background, which you have a lot of them in influencers, right? And I think that
Also in government.
Not you, Troy. Everybody else.
That's where they hired you, Troy, because they got all,
I think, look, here's what I'll say. Some disruption in even in our healthcare system is not a bad thing, right? I mean, and so we have to
disagree with that. I
right?
think
So, but disruption has to be thoughtful in it, right? If it's destructive, then you don't know what's going to come next. And so, do I think our healthcare system is broken? Absolutely, I do. I think that it's hard to argue against that, right? And here's why I know it's broken, because we spend $30,000 per year on per capita on healthcare cost, and that is absolutely the top by 40% above the next, which is Germany, highest spend on a per capita basis. And out of the developed nations, we're on the bottom end of expected life, the average life expectancy. So one can very much claim that our system is broken.
Right, we're paying the most and we're getting the least.
Yeah, we're paying the most and we're getting the least. And it's getting worse. And so adjusted to even the pandemic, men in the United States, the average life expectancy has gone down by 5 years, if I recall the study, the recent thing that came out.
Wow.
So it's now below 80. It used to be around 84 or so. And so I think these are, you can't deny these issues.
right.
I've read during, even my wife's treatment, we were looking at like, what can we do differently? And there were people talking about go vegan and eat nothing but leaves and, vegetables and green, and the problem with cancer is that it's a very hungry disease. It has a huge metabolism.
Right, well, I
so you have to
gave me diverticulitis, so I don't recommend it.
Right. And I think those are the things that I believe are, it's unfortunately an influences the uneducated who don't really want to question some of these things. And I think that to me is the bigger problem.
Well, and it also, when you're in that situation, when you have some kind of health crisis, whether it's yours or a loved one, you're vulnerable because
You
you're
are vulnerable.
looking for solutions. You're looking for answers. And and anybody that sounds remotely credible. I mean, if telling someone, stop eating meat. I mean, who's to say that wouldn't hurt?
I might try it. Right. I mean, I've lost 3 family members to cancer, and at different levels. Some where we had a longer runway, and we knew when it was just like this impending doom for 10 years versus a shorter duration, and others that went quickly. And you do get to a point where you're like, but I love this person, right? So we're gonna try whatever we can try. And I think that's why we so appreciate you coming on and sharing, your story and how you use that in your butterfly effect to move on and impact other folks. Is there are so many influencers out there that just say crazy stuff. I mean, and they say stuff they actually know is wrong as long as they're getting paid to do it. And that's so
terrifying
challenging about, I think, social media in general right now.
I agree. I agree.
How did you end up leaving government? Did you work yourself out of a job, or like what
Did an
happened?
election happen?
Election happened. Well, okay. So, in all honesty, I had committed to 2 years, and I was what they call a Schedule C appointee, and so I would have to get renewed anyway. But along the way, Adama, I was living in DC, and I call it. I started normalizing, like within myself, like who am I after all of this? Here I am. I did. There were two things that I was really looking for. I wanted to make an impact, and I wanted to go be a professor because I wanted to make an impact. And I started doing both. Luckily, I was fortunate to be able to get into teaching. But I was also starting to kind of rediscover like myself and what's important to me. And I also, to be very frank with you, I started realizing that maybe some of this stuff was ego driven and not necessarily something that Bryn wanted. I don't think that I think what she wanted probably was for me to kind of find happiness again instead of like honoring her. And so I kind of started coming to that realization that maybe some of it was, yes, I did want to honor her, but I think that honoring her would also be trying to live my life the way that she espouses life to be lived, including what she expected of me as her husband. And I learned a ton from her, like during our relationship as well as after. And part of it was like, I missed San Francisco. I'm from the Bay Area. I have an incredible community here. And I started, every time I'd come back into town, I realized how much I was missing this place. And so I had made a decision well before even the election that, okay, the two year that I committed to would be my 2 years. And so it would have taken really a big effort to kind of keep me in DC at that point. That's kind of really the driver. It was personal.
Do you have any concerns then, like watching everything that's going on in the news, seeing, Doge and do you have concerns about the work that you did, staying whole? Do you have concerns about the teams that you worked with? I mean, what is it? I have a lot of friends who, have worked at various times in government at all kinds of different places. And it's been tough for them to watch what's happening to some of their colleagues and friends and at work, frankly.
Oh, yeah, I do have concerns. I think that, look, I mean, some efficiency is not a bad thing. And I think that sometimes any organization, regardless if it's the size of a government or something else, has to go through that. But, what happens is, unfortunately, sometimes collateral damage happens as well. And I think those are the problems that I have. Now, I will also say this, break things and fix it is a very Silicon Valley kind of thought process. I don't think you can do that with the government itself. And, I wish that it could have been a little more thoughtful. If let's say I was in the government and someone came to me like, hey, I need you to kind of drive some efficiency, I would have done that. And if I had the tools, including the legal capabilities to be able to drive that because of, unionization and things like that. Because I knew what would be the best for my organization, right? And I think that's maybe what they should have done, right? I think in the old days, they call that sequestration, which is like, we're going to do that by we're going to say you need to cut 10%, 15% off your budget. And now all of a sudden you have some tools at your disposal to say, okay, how am I going to do this?
Well, if you're going to play the game of like move fast, break things, move fast, break things, like you have to have a plan to fix them. And
and I don't think that
when we're looking at agencies, we're just move fast and break them. And it's like, and then what?
And then get sued, hire people back, and then realize that we're not funding cancer. And then
so we inadvertently shut down all the clinical trials. Yeah. Sorry about your mom. I don't know. I mean, you got to have the plan. That's why I thought it was really interesting when you talked about your whiteboarding, because I don't think I know a lot of government agencies don't do that, right? They don't think through what is the implementation. In fact, if more regulatory bodies started thinking through how will we implement this, I would have fewer clients. So I know that they don't think about it on the natural.
Samantha, I hate saying this. One of my thing was to improve communication. So I actually launched a communication strategy. I said, I want a little bit clearer communication on the regulatory pathways. And I said it was the kind of the death to the regulatory consultant. So, the point was, the point I was trying to make in that, in kind of that program was like, it's not really, I'm joking a little bit about that, but it was that we are responsible for communicating this stuff. And it was changing the relationship between a regulatory agency and its constituents. That's what I was really trying to do, right? So we have to make it easy. And why I wanted to focus on that as well is that, I worked for a big company and, we had 50 or so regulatory affairs folks on staff. We know how to navigate the system. But a startup where a lot of the innovation is happening, especially in the healthcare, they don't have that, right? And they have finite amount of capital that they should be actually investing in the product itself and not necessarily the navigation, the regulatory navigation. And I think that was really the driver behind why I wanted it. Now, will it survive? I don't know. I mean, that's a good question, right? I mean, I'm unfortunately bound by law to not have contact with FDA for a year. And so I really don't know. And I've been trying to, obviously respect that. Well, it is actually a legal thing. It's not just about respect.
So you actually have to do that.
I have to do that.
We call it burn in the band, Troy. You gotta burn your band.
Right. So I'm hoping it was because none of this stuff, no one can claim that any of the things that we're working were political in nature. And they were certainly not, political ownership of Republican versus, Democrats. And so I think anyone would look at it and say, oh, these are actually very thoughtful kind of business requirement-driven things that we really prioritize.
Well, and to be frank, and I think this is what so many people are frustrated about from a voting perspective and a constituency perspective, like keeping your loved ones alive and having, good health should not be a partisan issue.
But we've made it partisan. I mean, and unfortunately we used, edge cases to say that healthcare is not partisan. But I mean, I think this is the dangerous part behind it. And I think that, I would recommend reading that book, A Death to Expertise by Tom Nichols. And this has been happening for a while. This is not a new phenomenon. Like we've been kind of fighting expertise for the last few decades now. And I think
we talked on a prior episode with somebody who used to work at FEMA about how the pandemic really did bring that to light, that, people just didn't want to pay attention to science because it disrupted their lives.
We've now reframed it as elitism. Like if you are using science or logic, you're elite and you're calling me stupid. It's like I'm literally trying to keep you alive or dig you out of a ditch or keep your house from washing away into the river. I mean, I guess if that's elite, then I'm, that's me doing the elite stuff.
Yeah. It's crazy. We live in wild times, friends. But as we come to a close, Troy, I'd love, we like to leave our listeners with some empowering advice. And so if you have, any sort of takeaways that you'd like to leave them with, would love to hear your thoughts. I know we chatted about a few things, but whatever comes to mind. Well, okay, maybe specific to your healthcare and navigating the system we're in.
Give us a big idea. You have 2 minutes.
Oh, big, yeah, I know, right?
Run with it. Run with it.
Run with it.
And with no notice, go.
Well, I think healthcare is in your hands. Like you have to really understand what's going on with you, and obviously invest in your health. It's like the number one thing, right? I mean, it's the number one thing that allows you to do. The thing is, I've also, we don't really talk about this, and I think this was the conversation, Madeline, we were having, is that we don't talk about death enough in our society. And I had very deep conversations with my wife around this, even before she was sick, around what we would want. And we established a trust. We had medical directives, and that was very helpful in even navigating her illness. And it doesn't make it easier to make decisions, but nonetheless, you understand exactly what the other person wants, because often we do things for selfish reasons and we keep people alive against their will. And so
Or the
I think that we need to have more open and honest questions, conversations about death and end of life, which we don't do in this country.
No.
And, I think like 30% of healthcare spend is in the last 2 years of someone's life. So we're trying to keep them alive. And that's a fairly big number. And that number is going to go up because you have a very rapidly aging population, a very large population of baby boomers.
Right.
Just something to think about.
I love my daughter, but I don't know that I want her making all my health decisions. My parents are older. We have different values. I don't know that I want them making my health decisions. And I'm like, hey, girl, and we're both single. I'm like, girl, it's you. Like, I literally just had to fill out emergency contact paperwork for something. And I was like, Adama Iwu. Because you got to have your people. And some people you can trust to make those decisions in the worst of circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's very real, unfortunately. Okay, well, on that somber note, thank you for being with us today.
It's not.
It's not a somber note.
So the ladies know this. My mom passed away very recently, and she made a lot of decisions ahead of time that really did ease the situation for my brother and I and the rest of the family. And it was things like you said, the medical directive, having a will and trust, having her funeral prepared and paid for so that, at the last minute, I mean, we sat down with the mortuary and they were like, yeah, she had, I think we had like $10,000 left. And they were basically like, yeah, we can't even start having a conversation with you about the burial or anything else until that's paid. And thankfully, we were in a position where we could do that and take care of it and get that moving. But my mom had taken care of so many other things. We didn't have to pick out a casket. We didn't have to figure out what she wanted. And so I will say to all of our listeners, even if you think you're too young or it's not the time or it's such a icky topic, taking care of your last wishes is a wonderful gift for the family. It's a wonderful gift at a really, really trying time. So to have been able to have those conversations with your wife and know, what she wanted and in the last days, minutes, hours, how she wanted her life to look as she's transitioning and how she wanted to spend time with your family, that's a gift. It's really a gift. So
it is. And having done both, the other side of it is hard, right? Like, because you end up in a perpetual place of like, did I do the right thing?
Yeah.
And you do ask those questions of like, am I honoring this person's memory and what they want me to do and what they wanted me to do? And, it's not the rest of your life. So,
yeah,
it's important.
Yeah.
Now we're all depressed.
I know.
I was like, okay, I wasn't going to go.
Thank you for having me on this.
I was like, all right, I'm almost out of wine. I've been
like to come back, right?
I've been portioning my wine out for this.
All right. Well, thank you. This was awesome. Really appreciate you coming on. And have a great week, friends. We'll see you next time.